Today we're going to look at the Korean War and really the spread of communism from not just Europe but into Asia. For the first part that we've talked about with the Cold War, we focused on the Soviet Union and Europe with communism, but today we're going to look at the spread of communism, which went to China and then got us involved into the Korean War. As the Cold War began, one of the first policies that we had was a policy called containment, which was designed to keep democratic nations from being overrun by communist uprisings and to keep democratic countries democratic. Well, many American politicians and people believe that the containment policy was working in Europe, but as we thought it was working in Europe, the most populated nation in the world, China, became a prime candidate for this communist uprising. Communist China, led by Mao Zedong, probably saying that incorrectly, but we'll just say Mao, was helped by the Soviets to overthrow the nationalist government, which was democratic at this time. Remember, in World War II, Japan had invaded China, and we came to the aid of China as we got into World War II. So China is then overthrown by their democratic government with the communist government led by Mao. And as this happens, President Truman refused to recognize this communist government in China. China tries to get into the United Nations, and President Truman vetoes this from happening. The United States prevents the admission of what was called Red China, or Communist China, from joining it. Truman further pledged to protect the nationalist government on Taiwan against any communist attacks. So now this Truman doctrine of making sure that these democratic nations that are being attacked by communist uprisings and providing military and financial aid to these countries was mainly primarily in Europe and around that area, but now it's starting to spread into other parts of the world. Now we get into the Korean War. Right after World War II ended, Korea, which was a former colony of Japan in World War II, was divided into two parts, North Korea and South Korea. North Korea became a communist nation that was supported first by the Soviet Union, and then as 1949 comes and China becomes a communist nation, they gain the support of China. South Korea was a democratic nation as it had an elected government, and that was supported by the United States. The dividing line was known as the 38th parallel line, which separated the two countries into communist North Korea and democratic South Korea. So in 1950, only 1 year after China becomes a communist nation, North Korea actually invades South Korea. North Korean forces invaded South Korea in an attempt to unify the country under communist rule. As this takes place, Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union felt that the Americans would not care enough to become involved in this conflict. The South Korean army was inefficient, not motivated, and the troops fled south as the North Korean troops continued to advance. So President Truman decides that U.S. troops need to be sent to South Korea to resist this invasion from the North Koreans. So this is a complete change from the mindset of America at the beginning of World War I and with World War II. Remember, when there was conflicts in Europe, we didn't want anything to do with that. We said that's Europe's problem, not ours. Well, this problem was in Asia, still very far away from the United States, but the mindset this time is, well, China fell to communism. We have to make sure that South Korea does not fall to communism as well. So that Truman Doctrine really takes place. So President Truman works with the United Nations, and they agree and is voted upon to actually pass this resolution to send troops that were mainly American to South Korea. So the Korean War actually becomes the first war that uses that international peacekeeping organization forces, the United Nations, to stop this aggression by North Korea. And this begins in 1950. As the war got underway, the North Koreans were really defeating the forces of South Korea. So President Truman sent General Douglas MacArthur to command the U.S. forces as part of the United Nations, and he's the one that during World War II was the main commander or main general of the Pacific Islands, and it was very successful. He's this big World War II hero, had experience in that area of the world, and so what MacArthur does is he lands his forces at Incheon in the middle of the peninsula. And this landing surprised North Koreans, and it cut off their main forces from the north, and it reversed their entire military situation. This became the second largest seaborne invasion in history, and then MacArthur kept attacking North Korea, eventually advancing his troops to this Yalu River, which separated North Korea and China. So he gets all the way up to pretty much the Chinese border and was successful in repelling the North Korean troops. Well, this is what gets China involved, and China sends a bunch of force to help North Korea and eventually pushes back the Americans and the United Nations and the South Koreans back to that 38th parallel line which separated the two countries. And as this happened, General MacArthur and others, but mainly General MacArthur, wanted to keep fighting and get back China from the communists, and he even thought that using nuclear weapons would be a good idea. So his goal was to not just take back North Korea, but also to take back China from the communists, even if that took an atomic bomb. So in 1951, China has, with North Korea, has pushed back MacArthur and South Korea back to that 38th parallel line. As MacArthur wants to use an atomic bomb on China, President Truman disagrees with this over the issue. Well, General MacArthur actually tells a congressman some things that criticizes President Truman. That gets out to the newspapers and shows in the newspapers that General MacArthur, who's this really decorated war hero, is criticizing the president, and President Truman in 1951 decides to fire General MacArthur. His reasoning was that it was needed to keep control over the military, but many saw this as a controversial decision and really the turning point of the North Korean South Korean conflict in the Korean War. As we get into 1952, President Harry Truman's term ends or is ending, and Dwight Eisenhower is elected to be president of the U.S. He is a Republican. He was known as Ike and was very popular as the general who led the D-Day invasion and the defeat over Germany and the Nazis in World War II. So he's very popular, and he campaigns on this promise that he is going to end the Korean War. So at this point, the war had gone on for a few years, and after the Chinese intervened and pushed back General MacArthur and the South Koreans back to that 38th parallel line down here, it's hard to draw a straight line. As that happens, the war is basically a stalemate. North Korea gains control for a bit, then South Korea gains control. North Korea for a bit, South Korea for a bit. So it goes back and forth with really no progress after a few years. In 1953, the US and North Korea sign an armistice that ends the fighting, and then a demilitarized zone at that 38th parallel is designated to really be that border between the two countries. And so the same border at the beginning of the war is the same border at the end. So it's really not a victory for the United States. They wanted to keep North Korea out of South Korea, so that, yes, that happened, but they wanted to also get rid of communism out of North Korea. And so up to this point, really since the War of 1812, it's really seen as a war that the United States does not win. And so most Americans that were alive at this time, they were used to the victories in World War I, in World War II. And so this one wasn't quite the same, but still there were about 33,000 American troops that died in this war, and people are getting tired of war. And so they were happy for this conflict to end. So as we wrap this up, let's go over the Korean War one more time. In 1949, China falls to communists. And in 1950, communist North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union and China, invade the democratic South Korea. President Truman sends forces and with help from the United Nations to fight North Korea. General MacArthur is chosen to lead that fight. They make some progress and eventually lead the North Koreans back to the Chinese border. China sends more troops, pushing back MacArthur and the South Koreans back to that 38th parallel line. That's what the original border was between the two countries. MacArthur wants to make sure that China is not communist anymore, and even wants to send an atomic bomb or two to win that argument. President Truman disagrees. General MacArthur makes some critical comments of President Truman and is fired. Eventually, in 1953, as President Eisenhower takes over, he signs an armistice with North Korea that leaves Korea in the same exact position as it was before the North Korean invasion. And that is the same border between North Korea and South Korea. So this is the first actual conflict of communism and democracy. So again, we don't fight directly with the Soviet Union, but we are aiding a country to make sure that communism does not take over. And so this is just one example in that fight of communism and one chapter of the Cold War.